Diane Weston slid 3 envelopes across the boardroom table and said nothing. No presentation, no agenda, just 3 white envelopes and the kind of silence that makes people uncomfortable enough to fill it themselves. She was the CEO of Weston and Arch Group, a billion-dollar real estate empire she had built from nothing. The people sitting across from her were her 3 closest assistants. Smart, polished, ambitious. Every one of them had a 5-year plan and a LinkedIn profile to match. Inside each envelope, $50 cash. 7 days. No credit cards, no hotel rooms, no calling in favors from the company network, no sleeping at a wealthy friend's place, no personal vehicles. Phones on only so she could confirm they were alive. The 2 younger ones laughed. They thought it was some kind of social media stunt. But Jerome Banks, the lowest ranking of the 3, a black single father who had been poor long before this job made him slightly less so, just picked up his envelope, looked at it for a moment, and asked one quiet question. "Am I allowed to bring a photo of my daughter?" 7 days later, Jerome walked back into that office and placed something on her desk. And what he had done to survive went far beyond anything Diane could have imagined. If you're new here, this channel is where we tell stories about the kind of people who don't usually make the headlines. If that sounds like something you'd want to see more of, hit subscribe. It takes 2 seconds and it means a lot. Now let's get into it. Diane Weston had not always had a corner office. She had built Weston and Arch Group over 23 years, starting with a single distressed property in South Baltimore that nobody else wanted. She had negotiated the loan herself, renovated the units herself, and managed the tenants herself, all while working a second job to cover the months when the numbers didn't add up. By the time she was 35, the company was profitable. By 40, it was formidable. By 47, it was the kind of name that made other developers straighten their posture when they entered the room. But success had cost her something she couldn't name on a balance sheet. The people around her had changed. Or maybe she had changed and the people around her had simply stayed the same. Either way, she had noticed it more and more over the past year, the way her senior staff spoke in polished, rehearsed sentences. The way every presentation looked perfect, and every proposal promised the right outcomes. The way nobody ever said, "I don't know," or "I was wrong," or "I didn't see that coming." She had become surrounded by people who were extraordinarily good at performing competence. And now, she needed something different. Weston and Arch had recently acquired a large abandoned property on the eastern edge of the city, a former light manufacturing complex, 4 buildings, 3 acres, sitting empty for over a decade. The board wanted luxury condominiums. Diane had other plans. She wanted to build something the city actually needed: transitional housing, job training facilities, and wraparound support services for low-income single parents. It was the most ambitious project she had ever proposed, and she knew it would fail if she handed it to the wrong person. She needed someone who understood what it actually felt like to have nothing. Not as a concept, not as a demographic category in a market research report, but as a lived, physical, daily reality, the kind that shapes how you think, and what you notice, and who you remember to look after. She had 3 candidates. She had been watching all of them for months. Sophia Reeves was 29, and had worked in communications long enough to make it look effortless. She dressed impeccably, spoke in complete sentences, and had an instinctive feel for how a story should be shaped and who it should be pitched to. She was genuinely talented. Diane had never doubted that. But Sophia had grown up comfortable, moved in comfortable circles, and built a professional network that functioned more like a social club than a support system. She believed with quiet certainty that knowing the right people was the solution to most problems. Diane had watched her talk her way out of a dozen difficult situations without ever having to sit in the difficulty itself. Caleb Morrison was 27 and had graduated near the top of his class from a school whose name opened doors before he even knocked. He spoke fluently in the language of business strategy frameworks, leverage points, scalable models, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had been told he was exceptional for long enough that he had stopped questioning it. He was sharp. Diane respected his mind. But she had also noticed that Caleb had never been in a room where he wasn't protected by something: his credentials, his title, the infrastructure of the company, or all three at once. She had never seen him work without a net. Jerome Banks was 34 and had the kind of quiet that people mistake for disengagement until they pay closer attention. He was the lowest ranked of the three, an operations assistant technically, and his title did not begin to describe what he actually did. He arrived before anyone else and left after almost everyone. He fixed the printer when it jammed, carried boxes when the freight elevator was out, and had been spotted more than once helping the cleaning crew break down the conference room after late-night board meetings without being asked and without making a point of it. He was a single father. His daughter's name was Maya, and she was 8 years old. He had raised her alone since she was 3, working whatever hours the job required, and arranging the rest of his life around school pickup times and sick days, and the particular arithmetic of a parent who cannot afford for anything to go wrong. Diane had never spoken to Jerome at length, but she had watched him the way he noticed things other people missed, the way he solved problems before they became visible to anyone else, the way he moved through the building like someone who understood that most of the work that keeps a place functioning is invisible by design. He was also the only person on her staff who had ever been genuinely poor. Not temporarily cash-strapped, not tight between bonuses. Poor in the way that leaves a permanent imprint. The kind of poor where you learn to read a room for danger before you read it for opportunity. Where you know exactly how much a gallon of milk costs, because the difference matters. Where dignity is something you carry carefully, because you've seen how fast it can be taken. Diane had built this challenge with Jerome in mind, though she hadn't admitted that to herself until the morning she placed the envelopes on the table. The rules were straightforward. $50, 7 days, no bank cards, no credit transfers, no calling in professional favors, no staying with wealthy contacts, no personal vehicles. Phones could remain on, but only for safety check-ins. Anyone who quit would be removed from consideration for the community project director position, a role that came with full authority over the Haven development, a significant salary increase, and the kind of work that might actually matter. Sophia had smiled when Diane finished speaking. Is this for a campaign because the content would be incredible? Caleb had asked whether there was a written agreement and whether the challenge constituted a formal workplace assessment under HR policy. Jerome had looked at the envelope in his hands. Then he looked up and asked if he could bring a photo of his daughter. The room was quiet for a moment. Diane said yes. Later that evening, after all three had left the building, she stood alone at the window of her office and looked out over the city. She thought about the first time she had truly gone hungry, not as a metaphor she had polished into a motivational anecdote, but the actual experience of it. She had been 20 years old, newly on her own with $30 and 6 days until her first paycheck. She had survived. She always had. But standing there watching the lights of a city full of people navigating versions of that same problem every single day, she asked herself a question she hadn't asked in a long time. When was the last time she had actually remembered what it felt like? She didn't have an answer. That scared her more than she expected. They left the building within 20 minutes of each other, each carrying $50 and a version of the same problem that looked completely different depending on who was holding it. The city did not adjust itself for any of them. Sophia walked 6 blocks before she slowed down. She had spent the first 10 minutes mentally reframing the challenge not as hardship, but as content. 7 days of living on $50 documented tastefully could generate the kind of authentic storytelling that no marketing budget could manufacture. She was already thinking about the angle, the headline. By the time she reached a coffee shop on Meridian Street, the one with exposed brick and pour-overs and a clientele that dressed like they had opinions about architecture, she had almost convinced herself she was here strategically. She needed to think. She needed Wi-Fi. She ordered a latte without looking at the price. $14. She opened her phone and started scrolling through her contacts. 340 names. People who had said at various rooftop parties and charity dinners some version of, "You're so talented, if you ever need anything, just call." She started calling. The first person was in a meeting. The second didn't pick up. The third picked up, listened, then said he was heading out of town this week. Terrible timing. The fourth said her guest room was being renovated. The fifth said she'd text back and didn't. By early afternoon, Sophia had made 11 calls, spent nearly $15, and had no place to sleep that night. She sat in the coffee shop for another hour after her cup was empty because she didn't know where else to go. For the first time in a long time, Sophia Reeves felt invisible, and she didn't know what to do with that feeling because she had spent her entire career learning how to be seen. Caleb had a plan before he hit the sidewalk. $50 was a constraint, and constraints were just optimization problems wearing different clothes. He had read enough case studies about resourcefulness under pressure to know that the real asset here wasn't the cash, it was the network. You didn't solve a resource problem by hoarding the resource. You solved it by converting it into something with higher leverage. He found a co-working space 4 blocks from the office and bought a day pass, $18 to use the Wi-Fi and the address. Then he spent $20 on a ticket to an evening networking event for early-stage founders. He told himself this was smart capital allocation. He worked the room the way he had been trained, to firm handshake, clean elevator pitch, genuine seeming interest in whatever the other person was building. He collected 11 business cards. He ate 4 mini sliders from the appetizer table and called it dinner. By the time the event wound down, he had $12 left, no place to sleep, and a growing awareness, which he was actively suppressing, that he had just spent the majority of his budget on the idea of opportunity rather than any actual opportunity. He walked to the public library, found a seat in the corner of the reading room, and sat there until a staff member told him they were closing. He spent the night in the library's covered entrance, sitting upright against the wall, telling himself this was temporary and manageable. He did not sleep. Jerome did not go anywhere impressive. He walked to the main branch of the public library and sat down at a table near the window with a piece of paper and a pen he borrowed from the front desk. He wrote 3 words at the top of the page: food, water, shelter. Then he drew a line through shelter and wrote next to it, find free or trade labor. He divided $50 by 7, $7.14 per day. He wrote that number down and looked at it not with panic, but with the focused calm of someone who had done this kind of math before in real life when the stakes were higher than a job title. He walked to a grocery store and bought a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, a bunch of bananas, and a large jug of water. The total came to $9.30. He stood at the register and did not flinch because he had already counted it in his head before he put anything in the basket. Then he found the address of a community center 2 miles away and walked there. The woman at the front desk, Dorothy, the center manager, looked at him with polite suspicion when he asked if there was any maintenance work he could do in exchange for a place to sleep. He understood that suspicion. He asked if he could show her instead of explain. She gestured toward the main hall where folding chairs needed to be stacked and a floor needed sweeping before the morning program. Jerome found the broom closet and got to work. An hour later, he had swept and mopped the hall, stacked the chairs, wiped down the tables, and fixed a ceiling fan in the back room that had been wobbling for 3 months. Dorothy watched him without saying anything. Then she unlocked a storage room with a folding cot in the corner and told him he could use it. Jerome thanked her, lay down with his jacket folded under his head, and thought about Maya, whether she had eaten dinner, whether she had done her homework, whether she had asked about him. He let himself feel it. Then he set it aside the way a man learns to do when he has no other choice. He was asleep within minutes. He still had $40.70 in his pocket. By day 2, the gap between the 3 of them had already become a canyon. Sophia, unwilling to spend another night at the train station, went to a diner near the station and asked if they needed help during the morning rush. The manager, a heavy-set man named Gerald, studied her for a long moment, taking in the tailored jacket and the good shoes, and said, "You ever bust tables before?" Sophia said no, but that she was a fast learner. Gerald handed her an apron. She worked 4 hours. She dropped a plate. She got an order wrong twice. At the end of the shift, Gerald handed her $12 cash and a plate of eggs she ate standing up in the kitchen. It was the best meal she'd had since the challenge began. Gerald told her she could come back tomorrow and that the break room had a cot if she needed it. She didn't examine why that felt like the most generous thing anyone had said to her all week. Caleb, with $12 remaining after day one, tried to stretch it carefully: a cheap breakfast, a free library pass, another attempt at finding short-term consulting work. He found no takers. People wanted someone who had built something, not someone who had analyzed what other people built. By the end of day two, he had $8 left and a growing discomfort he was working hard to intellectualize away. Jerome spent day two helping Dorothy with general maintenance around the center, earning his keep in labor and meals. He was careful with his remaining cash, eating his bread and peanut butter for lunch, saving the groceries to last. In the afternoon, Dorothy mentioned that the community kitchen in the back half of the building was short-staffed. Jerome offered to help without being asked twice. That was how he met Ruth Holloway. Ruth ran the community kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had learned to do important work with insufficient resources for a very long time. She was in her late 60s, small and precise, with a hand-lettered sign above the serving window that read, "Everyone eats." She had started the kitchen 11 years ago after her husband's illness had taken everything she and her husband had saved. Their alterations shop, their savings, their plan for the future. Jerome spent the afternoon of day two unloading a food bank delivery, reorganizing the dry storage so the oldest inventory was in front, and repairing a section of pipe beneath the prep sink that had been leaking slowly enough that everyone had gotten used to putting a bucket underneath it. Ruth watched him work without comment. At the end of the afternoon, she handed him a bowl of soup and sat across from him at the small staff table. "You don't talk much," she said. "I'm listening," Jerome said. She told him about the kitchen, the rent increases, the 60 to 80 people she served per day, the Fridays when the line went out the door. Jerome listened without offering solutions. Then he said, "You could get another 20 people through here if you shifted the serving line to the east wall. Cuts the bottleneck at the door." Ruth looked at the east wall, looked back at him. "You an engineer?" "No," Jerome said. "I just notice things." The next afternoon, he helped her move the serving line. Later, while they were portioning dinner trays, Ruth asked him why he wasn't spending his time earning money for himself. Jerome was quiet for a moment. "I've been hungry before," he said. "But the worst part wasn't the hunger. It was when people looked right through you, like you weren't there." Ruth set down the ladle she was holding and didn't pick it back up for a while. She didn't say anything, but she looked at him. Really looked at him in a way that told him she understood exactly what he meant. Because she had felt it too. And because the reason she ran this kitchen every single day was somewhere inside that same sentence. Back at her office, Diane was reading Dorothy's first update. It was brief and factual as she had requested. Sophia had found shift work at a diner. Caleb had attended a networking event and was now running low on cash. Jerome had fixed a ceiling fan, reorganized the food pantry, and spent his afternoon moving furniture so a community kitchen could serve more people. Diane set her phone down. She thought about a question someone had asked her when she was 25, pitching her first real investors. A man at the end of the table had leaned back and said, "You present well, but I want to know, have you ever really lost something?" She had been furious. She had thought it was condescending. She understood now that it was the most important question in the room. She had been looking for the answer to that question in the people around her for years, she thought. She just hadn't expected to find it in someone who was already working for her. Day 3 brought the first real cracks. For Sophia, the crack came quietly, not in the form of a breakdown, but in the form of a man with an expensive watch. She was working the counter at Gerald's Diner when a customer in his 50s came in, sat down, and when the college student working beside her named Priya brought the wrong order by mistake, responded in a way that made the room go still. It wasn't loud. It was the quiet, precise contempt of someone who had learned that cruelty lands harder when it's delivered calmly. Priya apologized twice, her hands shaking slightly. Sophia watched from across the counter. She felt something move in her chest. She thought about the 11 phone calls that hadn't been returned. She thought about the train station, and every time in her career she had watched something like this happen and had smiled politely and moved on because making a scene wasn't good for anyone's image, including her own. She set down the coffee pot she was holding.
She brought you the wrong order,
Sophia said to the man. It happens. You can speak to her like a person or you can leave. The man stared at her. Then he left. Gerald appeared from the kitchen doorway, read the situation, and said nothing, which was its own kind of permission. Priya looked at Sophia. You didn't have to do that. I know, Sophia said, and then, surprising herself, I should have done it a long time ago. In a lot of situations.
She lost the tip from that table.
Gerald docked her nothing. That night, lying on the cot in the break room, Sophia did not think about campaigns or positioning. She thought about Priya's hands shaking. She thought about what it costs a person to absorb that kind of treatment daily, year after year, because the alternative is losing a shift they can't afford to lose. She had spent 6 years telling other people's stories. She was only now beginning to understand that she had never actually listened to any of them. Caleb's crack was louder, and it came on day 4. He had been trying to sell himself as a short-term strategic consultant, finding free events, working every room, banking on his credentials to open doors. On the afternoon of day 4, he found what seemed like a real opportunity. A small group of 3 young founders building inventory management software who needed someone to help them think through their go-to-market approach. He sat with them for 2 hours and performed brilliantly. Frameworks positioning competitive analysis, all of it fluid and confident, and exactly what a business school trains you to produce. Then one of them, a young woman with paint on her sneakers and the direct eye contact of someone who could spot a gap between words and reality, asked him a simple question. What's the last thing you actually built yourself? No team, no budget, just you. Caleb opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He had managed teams. He had designed strategies. He had improved processes that other people had built and executed. But had he ever actually created something from the beginning with his own hands, when there was no infrastructure to fall back on? He could not think of a single example. I'm still working on that, he finally said. Everyone in the room knew it wasn't an answer. He left with no work and $8, the last of what he had since the networking event on day 1, and daily food expenses had steadily drained him. He walked for a long time. He passed a church with a sandwich board advertising a free dinner and stood outside it for several minutes before going in. He sat at a folding table and ate a bowl of chili next to a man named Dennis, who talked about his granddaughter for 20 minutes without asking Caleb a single question about himself. It was the most honest conversation Caleb had been in for years, not because anything profound was said, but because nothing was being performed. He stayed at the church's overflow room that night on a donated cot. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about the paint on that young woman's sneakers and the silence where his answer should have been. He still had his $8. He hadn't touched it after walking out of the founder meeting, partly because he was afraid to spend what little he had left, and partly because spending it felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit yet. Day 5 was when Jerome nearly broke. He was finishing the dinner service cleanup with Ruth when his phone buzzed. It was Carol, the babysitter, who lived 2 floors below him and had been watching Maya since she was 3. Her voice was calm and careful in the way people are when they're trying not to alarm you. Maya had a low fever. Nothing serious. She'd given her children's Tylenol and Maya was resting. But Maya had been asking for him repeatedly with the focused persistence of an 8-year-old who has decided that asking more times will produce a different result. Jerome stepped into the hallway. He could leave right now. He knew that. He could call Diane, say he was done, and be home in 40 minutes. The fever was low. Carol had said that clearly, but low wasn't the same as having her father there, and he knew it, and that knowledge sat in his chest in a way he couldn't reason away. But he also knew what this job could mean. Not just the title or the salary, though the salary mattered in ways that people who had never budgeted at his level couldn't fully appreciate. It was the project itself, the kind of work that could change what was possible for families like his. For Maya's growing up in buildings with no resources and fathers who worked every hour they could and still felt one emergency away from losing everything. He called Maya. She answered on the second ring, her voice small and slightly congested. Daddy. Hey, Bug. I heard you're not feeling great. I'm okay, she said, which was what she always said, which was something she had learned from him. "When are you coming home?" "A couple more days. I'm doing something hard, but I'm doing it for you." "Are you hungry?" she asked. He pressed the phone against his ear and didn't answer for a moment. "I'm all right," he said. "You eat your dinner." "Carol made soup." "Good. You rest. I'll be home soon." After he hung up, Jerome sat in the hallway for a long time. His remaining cash, after 7 days of careful spending, stood at $14.70, enough for food, enough to keep going. But he opened the pharmacy delivery app, found a better children's fever reducer than what Carol had on hand, and placed the order. $8.40 delivered to his address within the hour. That left him $6.30 for the final 2 days. He sat with that number. Then he went back into the kitchen and finished the cleanup without saying anything to Ruth about any of it. Day 6 was the hardest, and it had nothing to do with money. A man named Frank, a regular at the center with a short temper and a long history of feeling wronged, accused Jerome of stealing his wallet from the coat rack near the main entrance. He said it loudly in front of a room full of people with the absolute certainty that draws a crowd before anyone stops to think. Jerome felt the weight of it settle over him immediately. The specific, familiar weight of being accused in public of watching faces shift from neutral to suspicious in the time it takes to hear one sentence. He had felt this before. Not here, but in other rooms, other contexts, enough times that his body knew the shape of it before his mind had fully processed it. He did not raise his voice. He asked Dorothy to pull the security camera footage from the entrance. While they waited, he stood in the center of the room. He did not look at the floor. The footage showed Frank's wallet slipping from his coat pocket near the rack and sliding beneath the edge of the storage cabinet beside it. Jerome walked over, crouched down, and retrieved it. He handed it to Frank without a word. Frank looked at the wallet, looked at Jerome, said quietly that he was sorry. "When you've spent your whole life being suspected," Jerome said, "you learn to prove yourself with what you do, not with how loud you get." He went back to work. Ruth had watched all of it from the kitchen doorway. She turned around and stood at the stove for a long time, not moving before she started cooking again. That same evening, Diane received Dorothy's final update before the 7 days ended. She read about Frank, about Jerome standing in the center of the room and not looking at the floor, about the $8 spent on Maya's medicine, about the $6.30 remaining. She set her phone down and did not pick it up again for a long time. She had spent months designing a challenge that she believed would reveal character. What she hadn't anticipated was that it would also reveal something about her, about how long she had been looking past the person she needed because he didn't arrive in the packaging she had been trained to recognize. She thought about Jerome knocking on her open door, not yet certain he belonged in rooms like hers. She was going to change that. On the morning of day 7, Diane sent a single message to all 3 of them. "Come back!" Sophia arrived first. She looked different. The tailored jacket was wrinkled in a way dry cleaning would fix, but time wouldn't fully erase. Her hair was pulled back without care. She sat across from Diane and placed her hands flat on the table. 2 of her nails were broken. "I almost gave you up," she said. No preamble. "There was a man who wanted internal information about you, and I was hungry enough that I actually considered it for about 10 seconds. Diane said nothing. "I didn't," Sophia said, "but I want you to know I thought about it, because I think you should know who I actually am when things get hard." She paused. "I also spent most of this week realizing I've been telling stories about people for 6 years without ever actually hearing them." "What changed?" Diane asked. Sophia thought about Priya's hands shaking. "I stopped trying to figure out how to make myself useful," she said, "and I started noticing what was actually in front of me." Caleb did not come back on time. His email arrived at 9:47, 3 pages presenting a structured argument for why the challenge was a methodologically unsound assessment tool that failed to account for socioeconomic starting conditions and prior skill sets. Diane read the first paragraph and a half. Then she closed it. Not because it was wrong, but because it was exactly the problem. Caleb had taken the most honest thing he had ever said to her, that fragile, unguarded moment of self-awareness on the church cot, and buried it under 3 pages of framework. He had retreated into the only language that had ever made him feel safe. She pulled up a blank document and wrote him 4 sentences. I read your message from night 4. That one sentence told me more about you than 6 months of strategy decks. You don't need a better argument, you need a different environment. When you're ready to work without the scaffolding, come find me. She sent it before she could edit it into something more professional. Jerome arrived at 11:17. He knocked on her open door, which nobody did, because an open door was understood to mean, come in, and Diane noticed the knock. He was not yet certain he belonged in rooms like this one. He sat down and placed things on the table one at a time. First, $6.30 in coins and bills arranged in a small stack. Second, a single sheet of paper folded in thirds covered on both sides in handwriting every expenditure from 7 days, itemized with the reasoning noted beside each one. Third, a torn piece of notebook paper with a phone number and the name Ruth Holloway, Community Kitchen Director. Fourth, 3 pages of hand-drawn notes, rough sketches, measurements, observations about the community center building, layout problems, infrastructure issues, opportunities. Fifth, a drawing small and slightly crumpled, done in crayon. A man and a little girl standing in front of a building. Above them, in careful 8-year-old handwriting, Daddy's work. Diane looked at the itemized sheet. Every entry was precise, not just what he had spent, but why and what it had produced. Bread and peanut butter on day 1, the pharmacy delivery on day 5, $8.40 that had nearly wiped out his remaining cash, spent without hesitation. You spent $8 on medicine for your daughter, she said. That left you almost nothing for 2 days. She needed it. You could have quit and gone home. I thought about it, Jerome said. I thought about it most of that night. Why didn't you? He looked at Maya's drawing. Because going home that night would have been for me, he said. It would have made me feel better, but it wouldn't have made her life better, not in the long run. Diane set the sheet down. Tell me about the notes. Jerome pulled the 3 pages toward him and laid them flat. He hadn't planned to present them, they were just what his hands had done in the quiet hours between shifts. But he walked her through them, and as he did, Diane understood that what she was looking at was not a proposal. It was a diagnosis. He had identified the kitchen layout problem and already solved it. He had noted structural issues in the east wing. He had mapped walking distances to the nearest school grocery store and bus line. And in the margin of the 3rd page, he had written a single question that stopped her cold. Is there anywhere within a half mile where a parent working a night shift can leave a child safely? The answer was no. She knew that without looking it up. Tell me what you'd build, she said. If I gave you this project. Jerome didn't hesitate. Ground floor community kitchen. Ruth Holloway runs it because she knows these people and they trust her. Coin laundry, low cost. Evening childcare specifically for night shift parents because that's the gap nobody closes. Small repair workshop, tools available, basic skills taught because a lot of people in transitional housing have skills and no space to use them. He tapped the sketch. Upper floors for housing. Clean, functional, safe. Enough storage that families don't feel like they're camping. Shared outdoor space where kids can actually play. You said childcare before housing, Diane said. Jerome looked at Maya's drawing. Because a father who doesn't know where his child is can't focus on anything else, he said. He can't work. He can't sleep. He can't plan. Fix the childcare problem and you free up everything else. He paused. I know that because I live it. Every day. The office was quiet. Diane had interviewed dozens of candidates for projects like this. People with graduate degrees and published frameworks and TEDx talks about community development. They had all, in various ways, started with the building, the square footage, the cost per unit, the projected outcomes, the optics. Jerome had started with a child. 3 months later, the project had a name, Weston Haven. The board objected as Diane had known they would. 3 separate members raised the question of Jerome's qualifications in 3 separate meetings, each using slightly different language to say the same thing: he wasn't the right kind of person for this role. Diane listened to all of it. Then she made the appointment and moved on. To the board, she said, He has something you cannot teach in a business school. He knows what real deprivation looks like, not as a case study, but as a life. To Jerome privately, she said something different. You're going to have to prove yourself to people who will be looking for reasons to doubt you. I can't change that, but I can make sure you have the resources and the authority to do the work. The rest is yours. Jerome nodded. He had been proving himself to people like that his entire life. The difference now was that he was doing it from a position where the proof could actually build something. Sophia stayed. Her title changed. She no longer managed communications in the traditional sense. Her new role had no clean name on the org chart. She listened to residents, documented what they actually needed, and connected them to services. She wrote nothing for publication. She answered to Jerome and to the families in that order. It was the hardest work she had ever done. She was also, for the first time, certain it was real. Caleb left the company. 6 weeks after receiving Diane's note, he sent a 2-sentence reply. I read it every day. I'm not ready yet, but I think I'm getting closer. Diane kept the message. She believed him. Jerome moved to an apartment 4 blocks from the Haven site. Every morning, he dropped Maya at school, walked to the site, and spent the day doing what he had always done, noticing what was broken, figuring out how to fix it, and making sure the people who needed help were actually being helped, and not just processed. He knew every contractor by name. He knew every family on the waiting list. He knew which units needed better ventilation and which stairwell light had been flickering for a week, and which resident was 3 days from a crisis that no one else had noticed yet. On the day Weston Haven opened its doors, there was no ceremony. Diane had offered one. Jerome had declined. He wanted the first families to arrive without cameras, without speeches, without the performance of generosity that he had watched organizations put on for years, while the people they were supposedly serving stood to the side and waited for it to be over. So that was what happened. Families arrived. They were shown to their units. The kitchen served lunch. The childcare room opened at noon, and Maya, who had been talking about her father's building for 3 months, ran in ahead of everyone else and immediately began explaining the crayon drawing now mounted on the wall to a 5-year-old boy who had never seen his name written anywhere before. Jerome stood in the hallway and watched through the window. Diane came to stand beside him. How did you survive it? She asked. Not the challenge, all of it, the years of it. Jerome watched a father lift his daughter so she could see out the window of their new unit. Watched the daughter press her palm flat against the glass. I stopped trying to live like someone who had more than I had, he said. I counted every dollar, kept my head up, and never walked past someone who needed something I could give. He paused. That's it. That's the whole thing. Diane was quiet for a long moment. At the entrance to the building, behind a small piece of framed glass that Jerome had put up himself the evening before, was a stack of coins, $6.30, and beneath it, a strip of paper with 8-year-old handwriting on it. You're not a survivor because you had money left. You're a survivor because you remembered who you were living for. Jerome Banks didn't survive those 7 days because he was the toughest or the cleverest. He survived because he already knew something that took the others a week to begin to understand, that dignity isn't something you find when conditions are comfortable. It's something you carry when they aren't. That real strength isn't about never needing help. It's about never forgetting who else might need it. He counted every dollar. He kept his word to his daughter. He fixed things that weren't his responsibility to fix, helped people he had no obligation to help, and walked back into that office not with excuses or frameworks or campaigns, but with a hand-drawn map of what a community actually needs to survive. The world is full of people like Jerome, people who show up early and leave late and do the work that keeps everything running while the people with the titles and the credentials take the credit. People who have learned out of necessity to see what others overlook. If this story reminded you that those people exist, that they might be sitting right next to you in an office or a diner or a community center, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about the people who don't usually make the headlines, subscribe. We'll be here telling them.